Join me, Harriet Gould, for the Lab Matters podcast to hear fascinating stories every week from the inspiring people behind the science. In this episode of Lab Matters with me, Harriet Gould, you will hear from Stephen Tomisich about how he built his company with his wife and took it all the way to IPO and beyond. Today we have with us Stephen Tomisich. Stephen is the founder and CEO of Trajan Scientific and Medical. And what's interesting about Stephen is that he, yes, founded the company, but it was entirely self-funded for the first 10 years. And that really is quite unusual. I think it is anyway. So Stephen, welcome to Lab Matters. Thanks for coming. And can you talk us through how you came up with this company and what went on behind the scenes while you were trying to start it?
Well, thank you for having me on as well, Harriet. Yes, you have to be a little bit mad to go on the journey that myself and my wife, Angela, have been on. So if I rewind a little bit and share with you how Trajan came about, we met at college doing science together. We were literally bench lab partners. And we then pursued different career trajectories. My career was in the corporate world in analytical science, and Angela's trajectory took her through all sorts of industries. Ultimately, she ended up in clinical trials. And so she enhanced her original chemistry background with a biomedical background. But as we were pursuing our corporate careers, we were always a little bit entrepreneurial on the side. So it started off with things like property investment and doing renovations. And it seemed like every 5 years or so, the scale of those property activities seemed to escalate a bit. And eventually, after being married for, I think it was 7 or 8 years, our daughter came along, Danielle. And it was two key commitments we made to each other. The first one, which is advice I give to any parent, is we agreed to never disagree in front of our child, so that we were a unified um, group to deal with. And I can tell you that worked really, really well. It was okay after she was gone to say, "Why did you say that?" and to have a bit of a chat about her view versus my view. And the second thing was that we said we would never compromise her education. And so as we did these entrepreneurial things along our journey, we never took on anything so large that it would put at risk our daughter's education or put at risk having a good family home and led a relatively normal sort of existence. There was one point that we got into a retail business, but I can come back to that later if that's of any interest to you. But when we got to our big 50 birthday and our daughter had completed her secondary schooling and she was well on her way with her tertiary education, that was all secured, we sort of looked at each other and said, well, if not now, then when? And one of the ways I explain the moment that we decided to move ahead with Trajan is that sometimes you have a narrative in your head about who you are. And then one day you describe the reality of who you actually are, and there's a gap. And you have to do one of two things: either come to terms with the fact that you're not who you think you are, or you better damn well start doing different things and become the person that you think you're capable of being. And so we chose the latter. And the way we did it was Angela, myself, and our daughter Danielle, we did sit down at the kitchen table and we said, right, what are our options here? And we went through options like, let's continue our career paths. That's fine. We could do that. We did throw around an option of, well, let's just quit our jobs and take 12 months off and, find ourselves and find the world. And that idea quickly got thrown out because we're far too impatient to do that. And so we decided, well, it was time for us to do something in our own right that would be based on the career equities that we had built. And that career equity, the way I refer to it now, was the asset that you have. was a global experience in both biomedical science and in analytical science, and therefore that would have to be the basis of anything that we were going to do. And so before we even had a business in mind, we knew that we weren't inventors. It was never going to be a case of, oh, well, let's go back out into the garage and invent something. It was always going to be the case of we'd have to look to purchase something as being a starting point, because part of my corporate career was looking at businesses, acquiring them, looking for the diamonds in the rough, honing them and making them into something, better. But at that kitchen table meeting, it was our daughter Danielle said, well, if you're going to have your own enterprise, you'll need a name. And she was very interested in Roman history. And so she said, well, Trajan was the 13th emperor of Rome, who led Rome to its peak. He was known as one of the four emperors of excellence who did social good and built infrastructure. It sounds like a pretty good name. So the following week, Angela and I went down to a graphic designer and I said, okay, I want it to look like, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I want it to look like Sony. And the reason I said that was that having done, some work in the marketing space as well, I'm very mindful of the rectangular real estate you always have allocated whenever you try to present a brand. And if you look at the Trajan brand, it's strong like Sony. It uses the black and red color scheme, but it fully populates to the maximum any rectangular space that you have. And so, a week after the kitchen table meeting, we had a brand. We knew that it was going to be about science. We also knew that it had to be about translating, because in my corporate career, and indeed in Angela's biomedical career, one of the things that we were often frustrated by was what was possible versus what was actually being experienced in society, and the gap that existed between the two. And it was about 3 months later after that. So, okay, we're off. We've decided we're going to be this Trajan thing. We have no business, we have no product, but it certainly has started with an idea of what it had to be about. And we bought a little pathology consumables business. So this was a business based here in Melbourne that was importing products for anatomical pathology and supplying it to private pathology labs and to the hospital network in the state of Victoria. So for my background, I looked at it and thought, well, it's not a bad financial model to start off with. It was consumables, predictable, recurring revenue. The margins weren't too bad. But most importantly, the customer set was highly valuable because they were already in this healthcare sector, which clearly was going to be something about what we were going to do. So that's when we did the first really sensible thing, and that was that Angela quit her job and we bought that business by doing a small mortgage on the house. And she went down and started running that business with 7 people, no IT systems, all pen and paper. If a customer called and wanted to buy something, she'd have to run out the back and see if there was one on the shelf. But we were off and running. And so that was the very beginning of Trajan. So I might just stop there and see where that takes us.
It's just such a delightful story. I had no idea that you had bought it, and that it seems like it was bought in the dark ages if it didn't have a computer system. I mean, we're talking what, 2011? Um,
2011, but a little privately held business that really didn't have any systems or processes in place. And I guess that was where the beginning of our career experiences came to bear, because we were able to walk in and see immediately what it was missing
yeah.
and what it needed to be able to scale it.
Exactly. Um, it says it on the website, and I remember when we met for the first time that you said that your vision was to have an impact, a positive impact on human well-being. And I wonder if you can explain how that weaves into what you've got then, what you had then, and what you've got now.
I'll give you a really good example from what we had then, where we started. One of the first things we did, having bought that little business, was we went and visited our top customers and we asked our customers, why do you buy from us? What is it that we've just bought? And in doing that, we learned a lot about what we had just purchased. And one of those customers shared with us that a particular microscope slide that they found a sample of in Singapore was giving their pathologist much better outcomes for breast tissue diagnostics. And it was doing that because not only of the underlying quality of the glass, but because of the surface coating that had been applied to this particular microscope slide. But they had no idea where this slide came from or who manufactured it. So Angela, being quite the tenacious investigator, found out exactly who made it and where it came from. And we then started to import that slide. And here is a classic example of being driven by a purpose and having an impact can make you lead you towards what might not seem to be financially wise decisions. So the range of microscope slides that we're providing to anatomical pathology customers in the business that we bought, we were making about 50% plus margin. If we were to sell this new slide that provided this better outcome, we would be selling it and making only about 20% margin. And we did the non-financial thing. We said, if we deliver impact, if we make a difference, then eventually the financial rewards will come. And so what we then did over the next 10 years was that we worked with that manufacturer. We had the slides branded for Trajan, and we are now the number one supplier here in Australia. And last year, I think it was something like 5 million diagnostics that utilized our slide. And we know every single time it used, it made a difference. It meant there weren't repeats done. It meant they're not having to revisit the patient to take another biopsy. So it's a very straightforward example of where if you have purpose first and your purpose is aligned with delivering value, that you have to trust that ultimately the translation of that value will lead to financial success. We make more margin on that product now than what we ever made on the original slides that
Mm,
we acquired that were part of that business.
mm,
And so that's one example. But from that starting point, what followed was that the business I was working for at the time, which was SGE Analytical Science, so I'm still working in a full-time job. Angela's running the little startup with 7 people, down the road here in Melbourne, Australia. The owner of that business decided that they wanted to divest it, and through quite a long process, ultimately, we were able to find a way that we would be able to acquire part of that business. And that gave us a global footprint and a really nice starting point for making a business global rather than just based in Australia. And shortly after that, we acquired another pathology consumables business based in Sydney in Australia. So, and that came about because that business sent out notes to people saying they were about to close. I got on the phone and said, "Don't close it. I'm getting on a plane. I'll come up there and take over your people, your operation, and merge it with the one that we already bought." And so putting those 3 together then led us into about 3 years down the track, 2014 or so, it was early 2015. We brought a group together and said, okay, what is this business about now? And then it became really clear to us that if we looked at the landscape, coming back to our career equity, what we were participating in, that there was a role for measurement, for analytical science to infiltrate into the human condition, into human health. Because if we think about a lot of the studies being done, if you like, metabolomics, you're now seeing the emergence of LC mass spec systems and that type of technology being used. If we look at the measurement of pollutants in the environment or contaminants in food, again, it's analytical measurements that are bringing that to the fore. And often now you can find your applications, you're looking for the same analyte in different matrices, all having an impact on human health. Let's take forever chemicals and PFAS, which is the flavor of the month, right? Whether it's PFAS in blood or PFAS in soil or water or PFAS in food, it's the analytical technologies that are speaking to that threat, to human health. And so we decided that that was going to be the direction going forward, and that if we looked at what role could we play, we said, well, if analytical measurements are going to play a key role, measurements will become more important. What are the things that cause variations in measurement? The systems are getting now incredibly robust and reliable. But if we look at some of the parts that were once considered commodities, they actually touch the sample and cause variations. So whether it's an inlet liner in a gas chromatograph or a piece of nanobore tubing in an LC, or whether it's a surface coating that's rough and not smooth, or active and not inert, these factors impact the consistency and the quality of analytical data. And so we set a journey that said, well, let's look at every part of these systems that touches the sample, and how can we become best practice? How can we become best in the world, bit by bit, consumable by consumable, based on that premise that analytical data will play an increasing role in human health? And that then led us to further acquisitions. And as you say, we got to the point after about 10 years where we had about 450 people and about 70 million in revenue worldwide. Angela and I were still the sole shareholders. We had gone through some really tough times when we took on that larger business that gave us the global footprint. No bank would support us. The only way we could get funding for that was out of the UK, and it was a debtors factoring facility at 20% per annum interest rates. And so we did that, and we survived that, and we were able to sell off some properties and get debt down and start again. So by the time we got to going to IPO in 2021, we had done 7 acquisitions up until that point. And one of the things I didn't mention about the very beginning of Trajan was we also had a conversation about how far are we willing to go. And we made a decision that we were willing to risk everything. That because we were doing this at the Big 5-0, that if we fell over, if it didn't succeed, we still had time, we could start again. And if we were going to do it, well, then let's do it. And we did then go across the road that week. We spoke to our neighbors and said, you might think we're mad. This is what we're going to do. If we end up broke, can we live with you for a period of time until we get back on our feet? And it was a little bit of a joke, and our neighbors still remind us of that conversation now because we still have dinner with them occasionally. But we were serious that that was going to be the case. And so one of the things that happened during this journey was that we never shifted from that point of view. So no matter how dire the situation got at certain points along the way, or how confronting it got at certain challenges, and are we going to survive this next challenge or not, one thing we knew for sure was we weren't going to walk away, that we were always going to do whatever it took to find a solution and push through that next challenge. And I think one of the learnings that I've had thus far in this Trajan journey is that some of the cliches you get told in theory, when you read business books and you go to these wonderful lectures and so forth, was that, persistence is everything, that if you persist, you will find a way to succeed. And I have to say that actually living by that motto in this Trajan journey, it proves to be true. That if you are really committed to that premise, that you will not walk away, that you will persist no matter what, it's remarkable how many creative ways you come up with to solve a problem, and either go over the problem, go through the problem, go around the problem, ignore the problem. I mean, there's just so many options that you come up with because you've ruled out the option of walking away. So that's one nice part of the journey. And of course, from there we went to IPO and did lots of wonderful things from that point forward.
Lab Matters is brought to you by the award-winning temperature control equipment from Polyscience, available worldwide. Qualiscience, changing the world of temperature control forever. What was it like when you made the decision to go to IPO? Did you know that that's where what you were aiming for initially, or did it
No,
just come across your
we
desk?
that, we hadn't really contemplated that, and in some ways, it was COVID that triggered that. And what happened was after we'd made these 7 acquisitions, all 7 we knew beforehand. So it wasn't that we were responding to information memorandums and participating in competitive bids for businesses that were for sale. We were actually, like the first 3 examples, proactively going after things that we wanted to add, and often with people that we knew. In fact, the only business that we didn't know was the first one. And and so what started to happen was that other people we knew in the industry that were running smaller, medium-sized businesses that were clearly in some shape or form aligned with Trajan and what we were trying to do, we started discussions. And so when we went to IPO, we had 3 or 4 more businesses on our M&A list where we had discussions. We had heard the words, if they were ever to divest, their first preference would be to become part of this Trajan journey that we were on, that we were representing for them a wonderful alternative in that we weren't an investment bank, and then they didn't have to go through an information memorandum and be subject to all the scrutiny that that would bring about. And they didn't necessarily either want to divest to a large multinational where they might lose their brand, their equity, their life's work is, some of the phrasing that would be used. And here we were representing this alternative. So what we were confronted with by the time we got to 2020 or so was, do we now go into further debt to now make 20 million, 30 million, $50 million acquisitions personally? Or do we actually say, okay, let's just take a deep breath here for a moment because we're not 50 anymore, we're now 60. And you can't start again. Well, maybe you can. I take that back. Maybe you can. But there's a different view when you're 10 years older about what your risk tolerance is, and are you willing to double down yet again and roll the dice again? So, rightly or wrongly, we made a decision to take a little bit off the table, to go to. We thought about different ways of going about getting some equity off the table. And it seemed to us that some of those avenues were going to be through other parties who would ultimately list the business themselves anyway. And so again, we had the impossible, what was phrased as a stupid idea at the point. Well, why don't we just go to IPO ourselves? Why do we need to go through the middleman? We'll just do it ourselves. And so that's what we did. And by doing that, we were able to retain the majority and controlling interest. So we still own 51% of the listed entity, which allows us to continue to be true to our vision and true to the purpose of the organization, even though now we're 660 people and 160 million in revenue.
Such an unusually fortunate position to be in.
Yeah, I feel, yeah. Sometimes I pinch myself and say, did this happen? Like,
Hmm.
is this true? Am I going to wake up tomorrow morning and someone's going to say, oh, tricked you? It was just a story. It's not really true. Pay us back.
Luckily, that's not going to happen. Um,
No,
yeah, I hope.
I hope
Um,
not.
tell me a bit about that retail business you mentioned.
Right. So, we lived in the US for 4 years or so, and in fact, our daughter was born in the States. And when we moved back to Australia, Angela wanted to be pretty much a mum for a period of time and maybe do something else, as well. And we're having a coffee at the local mall, and we looked across and we saw a for sale sign in a little fashion business. And so we did the sensible thing. We walked over, we asked them what this was all about, and we bought
Yes, the
it.
sensible thing. Absolutely. I'll remember that.
And one of the reasons we did it, and what I was really interested in, was that our careers thus far had been in this world of analytical science, and what I wanted to understand was the skills we had developed, the things we had learned, were they applicable elsewhere? Or were we just really these geeks that understood, this scientific world? And so we took that business, we relocated it into a more modern store. We did some research around, and not that I don't get the wrong idea, but I watched customers from afar to try and understand what the customer behavior was. And we noticed all sorts of things about customer behavior. And so we reorientated the way garments would be presented and positioned and so forth in the store. And we created a paradigm where we said, well, this retail game is a bit silly because you go and buy stock and you hope people come to buy it. Why don't we ask our customers what they want, and why don't we build a brand and equity around servicing our customers? And so what we did was we formed a club where we understand the color preferences, the brand preferences, the size of our various customers. And so when Angela would then go to the suppliers, instead of saying, oh, I'll have one size 10, one size 12, one size 14, one size 16, she'd buy three 14s and a 10 because she knew that her customers were dominantly of a certain size, and she knew that they preferred black and blue compared to yellow and red. And so we changed the paradigm where she would buy for our customer set. And then we would reward those customers for frequent purchases and provide them with vouchers when it was their birthday and all those sorts of things. And it worked. And so the business was off and running. And then we saw another retail business that was for sale about 5 kilometers down the road. We went and had a look at that and we said, okay, we could just replicate this again and build up this chain of, essentially franchise this model that we had developed. And we started to look at that second business. And that's when we said, oh, hang on, what are we doing here? Do we really want to be in the rag trade? Do we really want to go down this path of ending up in the retail sector, in the clothing industry? Let's just stop and say, nice experiment. We learnt a lot. Now let's get back to who we are and where our education and our global experience is, and that's in analytical science and biomedical science. So we got to that point with that little adventure.
Oh, such a thoughtful approach that you just described there. I wonder how many other people in retail take that. I mean, I know there's a lot of footfall experimentation, with some of the bigger supermarkets, but I'm not sure. I don't know how the smaller outlets approach it.
Yeah.
Possibly not like that.
Yeah, it
Um,
it was really an interesting experience.
I
But for
bet.
me, the benefit was that the truths remain in terms of understanding customers, their behavior, their mechanisms around purchasing and so on.
Offering the value.
Yeah, exactly. Adding the value.
So, you mentioned just then your education. What did you go to college in Australia?
I did. I went to Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology and did applied science with Angela. She did a year of pharmacy before that, and then
Mhm.
she went on and did the biomedical science, including a semester in the US at Cornell University as well. But yeah, that's the scientific background that we have.
And do you have scientific families, your parents?
No, not at all. Not at all. Angela's parents owned a fruit shop and then a delicatessen, and my dad was a tram conductor.
Tram conductor. Wow. So you've broken the mold and done it fairly successfully. In fact, you've basically created a new mold that we can all have a look at.
Yeah, and
So
we hope we've set an example for our daughter as well. So she's a physicist and she works at Trajan. She reminds me she's now even up to long service leave, so it's hard for me to even come to terms with that.
we talk about not trying not to think too much about time passing. We won't think about that. Oh, look, Stephen, just before we finish, I hope you don't mind if I put you on the spot. Um, well, you can combine it with the company as well, but what I like to ask people is what their hopes are for the future of science. So you can do that in the context of Trajan if you like, or you can do it more broadly.
Um, I occasionally do a few little posts on LinkedIn and write an occasional article. I haven't been particularly prolific about it. One of the things I commented on recently is the importance of the scientific method. And if there's one message that I think would be beneficial to the world right now as it relates to science, so I'm taking the opportunity of your question to just twist it a little bit, is that the scientific method is about gathering data, gathering information, and on the basis of a hypothesis that you may have and observing that data, then coming to a conclusion whether that hypothesis was right or wrong, and be open-minded and be willing to change your point of view and perhaps do another experiment to learn more. In other words, the scientific method is about experimentation, and through that experimentation, learning and developing, and therefore improving your perspective and your point of view. And if we think about, the history of mankind, it has progressed based on that process. What concerns me a lot these days is that in some areas we've reversed that we start with an unmovable position, an unmovable view of what is right. And then we selectively take data that supports that point of view. And if we again reflect on the history of mankind, there's a previous period in our history called the Dark Ages. And that's how it came about. And so, one thing that concerns me greatly these days is to hopefully find ways for us as the human species that has the custodianship of this world, under our watch, is able to use this wonderful brain power that we've been given to use the scientific method of observation, experimentation, to learn, grow, be willing to change our views and become better, rather than the alternative that scares me quite a bit.
Hmm. That sounds political, philosophical, and scientific.
I'm trying not to be too political.
Yeah, I got that. Stephen, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you for sharing your story with us today. I hope we'll be able to meet again. But for now, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.